Since my son moved abroad, I never told my daughter-in-law that he sends me monthly payments, and I'm glad I kept it secret, because what she did next left me speechless. Before we continue, please write in the comments which country you're listening from. Enjoy the story. My name is Dorothy Mitchell, and at 58 years old, I thought I had learned all there was to know about keeping family peace. But nothing could have prepared me for what Jessica, my daughter-in-law, would put me through in the months following my son, Michael's move to London. It was a Tuesday morning when she knocked on my apartment door, her designer heels clicking impatiently against the worn hallway carpet. I opened the door to find her standing there in a pristine white coat that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in 3 months, her perfectly manicured fingers already reaching for her phone to check messages. "Dorothy," she said without looking up, brushing past me into my small living room. "We need to talk." I closed the door gently, my arthritic hands moving slowly with the lock. 3 years of widowhood had taught me to appreciate quiet mornings, but Jessica's presence always seemed to fill spaces with a certain tension that made my chest tighten. "Would you like some tea, dear?" I offered, smoothing down my simple house dress. I had been in the middle of organizing my weekly pill container when she arrived, and the small plastic compartments were still scattered across my kitchen table. She glanced around my modest apartment with that familiar expression I had grown to recognize, a mixture of pity and mild disgust that she tried to mask behind concerned smiles. Her eyes lingered on my second-hand furniture, the faded curtains I had sewn myself years ago, and the small television that had been a wedding gift back when Michael was just a dream in his father's eyes. "No, thank you," she replied, settling herself on the edge of my sofa as if afraid the fabric might stain her expensive clothing. "I won't be staying long." I lowered myself into my favorite armchair, the one Robert had bought me for our 20th anniversary. The cushions had molded to my body over the years, providing comfort for my aching joints in ways that Jessica's world of luxury probably couldn't understand. She was scrolling through her phone again, her long acrylic nails tapping against the screen. "Jessica, how are things with you and Michael?" I asked, trying to bridge the uncomfortable silence that always seemed to stretch between us. "He sounded so excited about the new project when we spoke last week." Her head snapped up, and something cold flickered in her blue eyes. "You spoke to Michael last week?" "Well, yes. We usually chat every Sunday evening. Just catching up, you know how it is." I fidgeted with the hem of my dress, suddenly feeling like I had said something wrong. "Right." She set her phone down on my coffee table with more force than necessary, and I noticed she had a new ring, something with diamonds that caught the morning light streaming through my thin curtains. "Actually, that's part of what I wanted to discuss with you." My stomach began to flutter with the kind of nervous energy that had become far too familiar in recent months. Ever since Michael had moved to London for his consulting job, Jessica had been visiting more frequently. But these visits never felt like the warm family connections I had hoped for when my son first brought her home. "Dorothy, I think we need to have an honest conversation about your situation," she continued, gesturing vaguely around my apartment. "Michael and I have been talking, and we're worried about you living alone here, especially with your arthritis getting worse." I felt my cheeks warm with embarrassment. It was true that my hands weren't what they used to be. 30 years of nursing had taken their toll, and the arthritis that forced my early retirement seemed to be spreading to new joints every month. But I managed perfectly well on my own. "Thank you very much. I appreciate your concern, dear, but I'm doing just fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The neighbors are lovely, and Mrs. Patterson from upstairs checks on me regularly." Jessica's laugh was sharp and brief. "Dorothy, please, look around. This place is falling apart, your furniture is ancient, and I can see the water stain on the ceiling from here." She pointed toward the corner, where a small brown patch had appeared after last winter's storm. "You're living like someone who can't afford better." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had never been rich, but Robert and I had always been comfortable. After he passed, I had made the difficult decision to downsize, selling our family home to help Michael with his education and his move abroad. Every sacrifice had been worth it to see my boy succeed, but sitting here listening to Jessica's assessment of my life, I felt smaller than I had in years. "I'm managing my finances just fine," I said quietly, but even to my own ears, the words sounded weak. "Are you, though?" Jessica leaned forward, her expression shifting into what she probably thought was gentle concern. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're barely scraping by, and that's not fair to Michael." "What do you mean?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. "He feels guilty, Dorothy. Guilty about leaving you here alone, guilty about your living conditions, guilty about not being able to help more financially." She picked up her phone again, swiping through what looked like expensive handbag listings. "It's affecting our marriage. Honestly, he's constantly worried about you, and it's putting strain on our relationship." I stared at her, feeling something cold settle in my chest. Michael worried about me? He had never mentioned any concerns during our weekly calls. In fact, he always seemed cheerful and excited to share stories about his new life in London. But, then again, he had always been the type to protect me from his worries, just like his father had been. "I don't want to be a burden," I said, and hated how my voice trembled slightly. "You're not a burden, Dorothy. You're family." But the way she said it made it sound more like an obligation than a blessing. "That's why we've been looking into some options for you." After Jessica left that morning, I found myself sitting in my kitchen, staring at a photograph of Michael's graduation day. He looked so proud in his cap and gown, his arm wrapped around my shoulders, while Robert beamed beside us. That was 8 years ago, back when we still lived in the 4-bedroom house on Maple Street, back when my world felt secure and full of possibilities. I had met Robert when I was 22, fresh out of nursing school and ready to take on the world. He was a construction foreman with calloused hands and the kindest brown eyes I had ever seen. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony at St. Mary's, and I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. For 15 years, we tried to have children. 15 years of hope and disappointment, of medical appointments and whispered prayers. When Michael finally came into our lives, we treated him like the miracle he was. Robert worked double shifts to afford the best schools, and I took on extra nursing shifts at the hospital to pay for his college preparatory courses. "That boy is going to change the world," Robert used to say, watching Michael bent over his homework at our dining room table. "He's got brains like his mother and determination like his old man." We were right about Michael's potential. He excelled at everything: academics, sports, leadership roles. When he received the acceptance letter to university, Robert actually cried. I had never seen my strong, stoic husband shed tears, but that night he sat at our kitchen table with the letter in his hands and wept with joy. The university expenses nearly broke us, but we never let Michael know. I sold my mother's jewelry, piece by piece, and Robert took a second job doing weekend construction work, even though his back was already giving him trouble. When Michael needed money for his master's degree in business, we mortgaged the house again without hesitation. Then came the opportunity in London, a position with a prestigious consulting firm that would set Michael up for life. The only problem was the cost of relocating and getting established in such an expensive city. Robert and I sat at that same kitchen table where we had celebrated Michael's acceptance letter, going over numbers late into the night. "We'll sell the house," Robert said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "Robert, this is our home. We've lived here for 25 years. And in 25 years, none of that will matter if it means our son gets the chance he deserves." He reached across the table and took my hand in his work-worn fingers. "Dorothy, we raised him to soar. Now we have to let him fly." So we sold our beautiful home on Maple Street, the one with the rose garden I had tended for decades and the oak tree Robert had planted when Michael was born. We used the money to help Michael relocate to London and buy this smaller apartment for ourselves. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, and we were happy because Michael was thriving. Robert's heart attack came 2 years later, sudden and merciless. One moment he was laughing at something on the evening news. The next, he was gone. The funeral. Expenses and medical bills ate through what little savings we had left, but I managed. I had always been good at managing. Michael flew home for the funeral, of course, bringing Jessica with him. She was beautiful and polished, everything I had imagined my son's wife would be. She worked in social media marketing, she told me, helping brands build their online presence. I didn't entirely understand what that meant, but she spoke about it with such confidence that I was impressed. She's perfect for him, I told my neighbor Margaret after they returned to London. She's ambitious and smart, and she clearly adores Michael. In the beginning, I truly believed that. Jessica would call me occasionally, asking about family recipes and sharing stories about their life in London. She seemed genuinely interested in becoming part of our family, and I was grateful that Michael had found someone who made him so happy. But something shifted after their wedding last year. The phone calls became less frequent, and when they did call, Jessica would often answer Michael's phone and keep the conversations brief. "He's so busy with work," she would explain. "You understand how important his career is right now." I did understand. I had always understood the importance of Michael's success. That's why I never mentioned the monthly transfers he had started sending me 6 months after Robert's death. £2,500 every month, appearing in my account like clockwork with a simple note. "Love, Michael." I had called him the first time it happened, worried there had been some mistake. "Michael, honey, I think there's been an error with your bank transfer." "No error, Mom," he had said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I want to make sure you're comfortable. Dad would never forgive me if I let you struggle." "But sweetheart, you're just starting your life with Jessica. You need to save for your future, maybe buy a house, start thinking about children." "Mom, I'm doing well here, better than I expected. Let me take care of you the way you and Dad took care of me." I had cried that night, overwhelmed by my son's generosity and love. But something told me to keep this arrangement private. Maybe it was the way Jessica had started making little comments about money during their visits. Or maybe it was my natural inclination to keep family financial matters discreet. Either way, I never mentioned Michael's monthly support to anyone. The money was more than enough to cover my modest expenses, and then some. I could have moved to a nicer apartment, bought newer furniture, treated myself to little luxuries. But the habits of a lifetime of careful budgeting died hard, and besides, I had grown comfortable in my simple life. Looking back now, I realized that Jessica had been watching me during their visits, cataloging every sign of what she perceived as financial struggle. The second-hand furniture, the careful way I shopped for groceries, my practical clothing choices. To her, these were evidence of poverty rather than the choices of someone who had learned to find contentment in simplicity. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat there that evening, thinking about Jessica's visit. She had married into a family that she clearly saw as beneath her social aspirations, and now she was trying to manage what she perceived as the embarrassing problem of Michael's struggling mother. But what Jessica didn't know, what no one knew, was that her husband's struggling mother was far from the burden she imagined. The weeks following Jessica's visit brought a series of small humiliations that I tried to brush off as misunderstandings. But looking back, I can see they were carefully orchestrated attempts to make me feel ashamed of my life. It started with the phone calls. Every Sunday evening, I would sit in my armchair with a cup of tea, eagerly waiting for Michael's call. But increasingly, Jessica would answer his phone instead. "Oh, Dorothy, Michael's in the shower," she would say, though I could hear him laughing in the background. "Can I take a message?" "I just wanted to catch up with him, dear. We usually chat on Sundays." "Right, well, he's been so exhausted from work lately. These international calls are quite expensive too, you know. Maybe we should limit them to once a month instead?" Once a month. My weekly connection to my only child reduced to a monthly obligation. I agreed because I didn't want to be a burden. But each Sunday evening that passed in silence felt like a small death. When they did visit 3 weeks later, Jessica's behavior became even more pointed. She walked through my apartment like a health inspector, running her finger along surfaces and making small, disapproving sounds. "Dorothy, this carpet really needs replacing," she announced, lifting the edge of my living room rug with her foot. "And honestly, the whole place smells a bit musty." I had cleaned for 2 days preparing for their visit, scrubbing every surface until my arthritic hands ached. The apartment smelled like lavender cleaning products and the vanilla candles I had lit that morning. But Jessica's words made me suddenly self-conscious about everything. The age of my appliances, the faded wallpaper in my bedroom, the small chip in my favorite coffee mug. Michael seemed oblivious to his wife's commentary, busy showing me photos on his phone of their new flat in Kensington. "Look at this kitchen, Mom. Jessica designed the whole layout herself. She's got such an eye for style." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, meaning it. Their apartment looked like something from a magazine, all clean lines and expensive fixtures. But as I looked at the photos, I caught Jessica watching me with that calculating expression she wore when she thought no one was looking. "We had it professionally decorated, of course," Jessica added. "I couldn't possibly live with cheap furniture or secondhand pieces. I just don't understand how some people can be comfortable surrounded by, well, other people's leftovers." She was looking directly at my sofa as she spoke. The same sofa where Robert and I had cuddled watching movies, where I had nursed Michael through childhood illnesses, where decades of family life had unfolded. To her, it was just a piece of second-hand furniture. To me, it held a lifetime of memories. The worst part was Michael's reaction, or lack thereof. He nodded along with Jessica's observations, occasionally adding his own comments about how cozy my place was, a word that sounded increasingly like a polite way of saying cramped and outdated. During lunch, which I had prepared carefully, with Jessica's dietary restrictions in mind, she photographed her salad before taking a single bite. "For my Instagram story," she explained, adjusting the lighting with her phone. "My followers love to see what I'm eating. Though I might not post this one, the presentation is a bit simple." Simple. There was that word again, spoken like an insult. I had arranged the salad on my best china, the set my mother had given me as a wedding gift. But looking at it through Jessica's eyes, I saw only outdated floral patterns and plates that had lost their shine. "Dorothy, can I ask you something?" Jessica set down her fork and leaned forward conspiratorially. "Are you receiving any government assistance? There's no shame in it, of course, but Michael worries about your pride, preventing you from getting help you might need." My cheeks burned with embarrassment. Government assistance? I had worked as a registered nurse for over 30 years, paying into the system, contributing to society. The suggestion that I was now some sort of charity case felt like a slap in the face. "I'm managing fine on my own, thank you," I replied stiffly. "But how?" Jessica's voice took on that false sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I mean, this apartment can't be cheap, even if it is rather basic, and your pension from the hospital must be quite modest." Michael looked uncomfortable for the first time during the visit. "Jess, maybe we shouldn't—" "No, it's important that we talk about these things as a family," she interrupted, reaching over to pat my hand in a gesture that felt more condescending than comforting. "Dorothy, there are lovely assisted living communities where you could have your own space but also have help when you need it. And they're much more cost-effective than trying to maintain an independent household." Assisted living. She was talking about putting me in a home, and she was doing it right in front of my son, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I don't need assistance," I said quietly, but my voice lacked conviction, even to my own ears. "Of course you don't need it right now," Jessica continued smoothly. "But think about the future. What happens when your arthritis gets worse? What if you fall and no one finds you for hours? What if you can't afford your medications?" Each question was like a small knife, cutting away at my confidence and independence. I found myself imagining the scenarios she described, and suddenly, my comfortable apartment felt less like a home and more like a trap. "We just want what's best for you, Mom," Michael said, but he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. And maybe Jessica has a point about planning ahead. That night, after they left, I sat in my kitchen crying for the first time since Robert's funeral. Not the gentle tears of grief I had grown accustomed to, but angry, frustrated sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my chest. How had I become this person? This burden that needed to be managed and handled. I had raised a successful son, had a career I was proud of, had been a loving wife and contributing member of society. When had I become someone who needed to be dealt with? I looked around my apartment with fresh eyes, trying to see it the way Jessica did. Yes, the furniture was older. Yes, the decor was simple, but it was clean and comfortable and mine. Or at least, I had thought it was mine until Jessica started making me feel like I was squatting in my own life. The worst part was the growing suspicion that Michael agreed with her. My son, who I had sacrificed everything for, seemed to see me through his wife's eyes now, as an embarrassing reminder of a simpler, less sophisticated life that he had left behind. But as I sat there in my small kitchen, wiping my eyes with a tissue, something inside me began to stir, a small flame of anger that I hadn't felt in years. Because Jessica didn't know everything about my situation. Nobody did. And maybe it was time they learned the truth. The dinner party was Jessica's idea, of course. "I want you to meet some of our friends who are visiting from London," she had said over the phone. "We're having a small gathering at that new restaurant downtown, and I thought it would be nice for you to join us." I should have known better. I should have recognized the careful way she phrased the invitation, the slight pause before she mentioned it was at a restaurant rather than their hotel suite. But I was so grateful to be included, so hopeful that maybe Jessica was finally making an effort to include me in their social circle, that I ignored the warning bells in my head. I spent the afternoon getting ready, choosing my best dress, a navy blue number I had worn to Michael's wedding, and doing my hair the way the girl at the salon had showed me. I even splurged on a taxi to the restaurant, not wanting to arrive windblown from the bus. The restaurant was one of those trendy places with dim lighting and prices that made my eyes water when I glimpsed the menu. Jessica had already arrived, with 4 other people, all around her and Michael's age, all dressed in clothes that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. "Dorothy!" Jessica stood up and air-kissed my cheeks in that affected way she had adopted since living in London. "Everyone, this is Michael's mother, Dorothy." The introductions were a blur of names and occupations that sounded impressive and foreign to me. Something about cryptocurrency trading, art curation, and sustainable fashion consulting. I smiled and nodded, trying to follow conversations about places I had never been and experiences I could never afford. "So Dorothy," said a woman named Penelope, with perfectly straight blonde hair and a handbag I recognized from a magazine advertisement, "Jessica tells us you're retired. How lovely to have all that free time." "Yes, I was a nurse for 30 years, I replied, trying to inject some pride into my voice. "Oh, how noble," she responded, in a tone that suggested she found it quaint rather than admirable. "Public health care must be so rewarding." Jessica jumped in quickly. "Dorothy lives in a charming little apartment across town. Very authentic neighborhood, isn't it, Dorothy?" The way she said authentic made it sound like a diplomatic way of saying run down. I felt my cheeks heat up as I realized that Jessica had positioned me as some sort of charity case, someone they were graciously including despite my obvious lower social status. "It's a lovely community," I said quietly. "I've lived there for 3 years now, since my husband passed." "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss," said a man named Rupert who worked in hedge funds. "It must be difficult managing on your own. Financially, I mean. Widows' pensions aren't what they used to be, are they?" I wanted to crawl under the table. Here, I was, surrounded by people discussing their summer homes in the Cotswolds and their wine-tasting trips to Tuscany, while they spoke about me like I was some sort of tragic figure barely scraping by. "She's very independent," Jessica said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes too independent for her own good. We've been trying to convince her to consider some more supportive living arrangements." "Oh, you mean assisted living?" Penelope leaned forward with the expression of someone who had found a fascinating topic of conversation. "My grandmother went into the most wonderful facility. They had activities and meals provided, and the family felt so much more at ease, knowing she was properly looked after. I sat there listening to them discuss my future, as if I weren't sitting right across from them." Jessica nodded enthusiastically, occasionally adding details about specific facilities she had researched for me. "The waiting lists can be quite long for the good places," Rupert added helpfully. "You'll want to get her name down sooner rather than later. Get her name down, as if I were a package to be shipped off somewhere convenient." I looked at Michael, hoping to see some sign that he was as uncomfortable with this conversation as I was, but he was studying his wine glass with intense concentration. "Actually," Jessica continued, and I heard the excitement creeping into her voice, "we've already scheduled a tour for next week. There's a lovely place called Golden Years Manor that has an opening. It's perfect for someone in Dorothy's situation." That's when something inside me snapped, not loudly or dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a door closing. "My situation?" I asked, and my voice sounded different even to me, steadier, colder. Jessica blinked, perhaps surprised by my tone. "Well, you know, living alone at your age, on a limited income, with your arthritis getting worse." "And what exactly do you know about my income, Jessica?" The table fell silent. Michael looked up from his wine glass, his eyes wide with surprise. I had never challenged Jessica before, never questioned her assumptions, or pushed back against her pronouncements about my life. "Well, I mean, it's obvious that you're struggling financially," she stammered, gesturing vaguely as if my financial state were written across my forehead. "The apartment, the furniture, the way you dress." "The way I dress?" I repeated, and I could hear the danger in my own voice. "Dorothy, I think Jessica just means—" Michael started, but I held up my hand. "No, Michael, I want to hear what your wife has to say about the way I dress." Jessica's face had gone pink, but she pressed on with the determination of someone who believed she was doing the right thing. "I just think that if you had more resources, you would take better care of yourself, live somewhere nicer, have newer things." I looked around the table at these strangers who had spent the evening discussing my poverty like it was a fascinating case study. Then I looked at my son, who couldn't quite meet my eyes. "You're right about one thing, Jessica," I said, standing up from the table. "I haven't been taking proper care of myself. I've been living like someone who doesn't deserve better, letting people treat me like a burden to be managed." "Dorothy, that's not what we meant," Penelope started. "But that changes tonight," I continued, pulling my purse over my shoulder, "because I'm done being treated like a charity case by people who don't know the first thing about my actual situation." I walked out of that restaurant with my head held high, ignoring Jessica's calls for me to, "Wait, don't be ridiculous, we were just trying to help." The taxi ride home cost me $25, but I didn't care. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the poor, struggling widow that Jessica had painted me as, but Dorothy Mitchell, a woman who had raised a successful son, who had worked hard all her life, and who was tired of apologizing for existing. When I got home, I went straight to my bedroom and pulled out a box I hadn't opened since Robert's death. Inside were all our important documents: insurance policies, bank statements, property deeds, investment records. Papers I had been too overwhelmed to deal with after the funeral, too content to simply exist quietly in my small apartment. But Jessica's humiliation had lit a fire under me. It was time to stop living like a victim and start living like the woman I actually was. It was time to show them exactly what Dorothy Mitchell's situation really looked like. The morning after the restaurant humiliation, I sat at my kitchen, table surrounded by papers I hadn't looked at in 3 years. Bank statements, insurance documents, property deeds, and investment portfolios that Robert had meticulously organized, but which I had been too grief-stricken to examine after his death. The first surprise came when I opened my checking account statement. I had been living so modestly, so carefully, that I hadn't really paid attention to the balance in months. I knew Michael's monthly transfers were there, but I had never added up exactly how much had accumulated over the past 2 years. $73,412. I stared at the number, certain there had been some mistake. I had been living like someone counting every penny, but there it was in black and white, nearly $74,000 just sitting in my checking account. Money I hadn't touched because I had convinced myself I needed to be careful, needed to save for emergencies, needed to live like the struggling widow Jessica believed me to be. But that was just the beginning. I picked up my phone with trembling fingers and dialed Michael's number, not caring that it was only 6 in the morning London time. "Mom?" His voice was thick with sleep and concern. "Is everything okay? You never call this early." "Michael, honey, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." There was a pause, and I could hear Jessica's voice in the background asking who was calling. "Okay, Mom, what is it?" "The money you've been sending me every month. How much is it exactly?" Another pause, longer this time. £2,500, Mom. "Why? Is there a problem with the transfers?" £2,500. I quickly did the math in my head. That was over $3,000 US every month for 2 years. Over $70,000 that my son had sent me out of love and concern, money I had barely touched because I was so used to living frugally. "No problem, sweetheart. I wanted to make sure I had the amount right." "Mom, you sound upset. Did something happen? Jessica mentioned you seemed a bit emotional when you left the restaurant last night." Emotional. That's how Jessica had described my response to being humiliated in front of strangers. "Michael, can I ask you something else? Do you think I'm struggling financially?" "What? No, of course not. I send you money every month specifically so you won't have to struggle. You should be comfortable, Mom. Are you not using it?" I closed my eyes, feeling foolish for the first time in years. My son had been trying to take care of me, and I had been so proud, so determined not to be a burden, that I had lived like a pauper while sitting on a small fortune. "I've been very careful with money, sweetheart, maybe too careful." "Mom, I want you to enjoy your life. That's why I send the money. You and Dad sacrificed everything for me, and now it's my turn to take care of you." After we hung up, I sat there, staring at the bank statement, my mind reeling. But the checking account was just the first revelation. Next, I opened the manila envelope containing Robert's life insurance policy, $400,000. The policy had paid out immediately after Robert's death, but I had been so overwhelmed with funeral arrangements and grief that I had simply let the money sit in a savings account, untouched. I had convinced myself it was an emergency fund, something I shouldn't touch unless absolutely necessary. But there was more. Robert had been meticulous about our finances, and as I worked through the stack of papers, I found investment accounts I had forgotten existed, retirement funds that had been growing for years, stocks that Robert had purchased decades ago that had split and grown into substantial holdings. Then I found the property deed that made me gasp out loud, the cabin in upstate New York. Robert's father had left him a small property on a lake, and Robert had always talked about fixing it up for our retirement. After his death, I had assumed the property was worthless, an old cabin that would be more trouble than it was worth to maintain or sell. But clipped to the deed was a real estate assessment from 2 years ago that Robert had apparently commissioned. The property was now worth over $200,000 due to lakefront development in the area. I sat back in my chair, my head spinning. Adding up just the assets I had found so far, I was looking at over $700,000. $700,000, and I had been living like someone who couldn't afford to replace a 20-year-old television. The phone rang, startling me out of my calculations. It was Margaret from upstairs, my neighbor who had become a good friend over the past 3 years. "Dorothy, dear, I saw you come home early from your dinner last night. Everything all right?" "Margaret, can I ask you something? Do I seem poor?" "To you?" she laughed, a genuine sound that warmed me. "Poor? Dorothy, you're one of the most financially stable people I know. You never seem worried about money. You keep your apartment beautiful. You're always well-dressed. Why would you think you seem poor?" "Jessica seems to think I'm struggling. She's been talking about assisted living facilities." "Jessica?" Margaret's voice turned sharp. "That daughter-in-law of yours? Dorothy, that girl wouldn't recognize class if it bit her on her designer behind. Just because you don't throw money around like she does doesn't mean you don't have it." After Margaret hung up, I called my bank and made an appointment for the next morning. I needed to understand exactly what my financial picture looked like, and I needed to stop living like I was one emergency away from destitution. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I ordered takeout from the nice Italian restaurant down the street. Not because I was too tired to cook, but because I wanted to treat myself. I opened a bottle of wine Robert had been saving for a special occasion and sat in my living room, really looking at my furniture for the first time in months. Yes, it was older, but it wasn't shabby or embarrassing. It was well-made, comfortable furniture that told the story of a life well lived. My china wasn't outdated. It was classic. My apartment wasn't cramped. It was cozy and efficiently organized. I had been seeing myself through Jessica's eyes for so long that I had forgotten to see myself through my own. As I sipped my wine and reviewed the financial documents spread across my coffee table, I began to understand something that changed everything. I wasn't poor. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't a burden who needed to be managed and placed in a facility for everyone's convenience. I was a woman with substantial assets, a loving son who was successfully supporting both himself and me, and decades of life experience that had value, beyond anything Jessica could measure with her shallow standards. But more than that, I was a woman who had been playing small for far too long. And that was about to change. The next morning, I walked into First National Bank wearing my best suit, the charcoal gray one I had worn to job interviews 30 years ago. It still fit perfectly, and paired with the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary, I looked like exactly what I was, a woman of substance. "Mrs. Mitchell," said James Harrison, the financial advisor who had handled Robert's and my accounts for over a decade. "It's wonderful to see you. How can I help you today?" "James, I need a complete picture of my financial situation. Everything. I'm afraid I've been rather negligent about managing my assets since Robert passed." He pulled up my accounts on his computer, and I watched his eyebrows rise slightly as he scrolled through the information. "Well, Dorothy, you've certainly been conservative in your approach, but that's actually worked quite well for you. Your portfolio has grown significantly since we last spoke." Over the next hour, James walked me through every account, every investment, every asset that Robert and I had accumulated over our decades together. The numbers were staggering. My checking account, $73,412 savings account, life insurance, $400,000 investment portfolio, $285,000 retirement accounts, $320,000 the lake property, $200,000 plus a small trust fund from my parents that I had completely forgotten about, $45,000 total liquid assets, over $1.3 million. "Dorothy," James said gently, "you're a very wealthy woman. Why haven't you been accessing these funds?" I told him about the past 3 years, the grief, the simplicity I had embraced, the way I had unconsciously started living like someone who needed to count every penny. "And there's something else," James said, pulling up another screen. The lake property has been receiving rental income for the past 18 months. Apparently, Robert had arranged for a property management company to handle seasonal rentals. Before he passed, they've been depositing the income directly into your savings account. Rental income. Another $2,800 per month that I hadn't even realized was coming in. After leaving the bank, I drove to the offices of Henderson and Associates, the law firm that had handled Robert's estate. Patricia Henderson, the senior partner, greeted me with the warm smile of someone who had guided our family through difficult times. "Dorothy, what brings you in today?" "Patricia, I need to understand something. If I were to become incapacitated, what would happen to my assets?" She pulled out my file and reviewed the documents. "Well, you have a very comprehensive will and power of attorney arrangement. Michael is your primary beneficiary and has power of attorney for health care and financial decisions if you're unable to make them yourself. So if someone convinced him that I needed to be in assisted living, he would have the legal authority to make that decision, yes. But Dorothy, why are you asking? Are you having health concerns?" I explained the situation with Jessica, the pressure about assisted living facilities, the way I had been made to feel like a burden who needed to be managed. Patricia's expression grew serious. "Dorothy, based on your financial position, there would be absolutely no need for you to move to a facility unless that was your personal choice. You could afford the finest in-home care if you needed it, or you could live independently for the rest of your life very comfortably. But what if Michael believes I'm struggling? What if Jessica convinces him that I can't take care of myself? Then we need to make sure he understands your actual situation," Patricia said firmly. "Would you like me to prepare a comprehensive financial statement that clearly outlines your assets and capabilities?" That afternoon, I had lunch with Margaret at the little cafe around the corner from our building. I had asked her to meet me because I needed someone I trusted to help me think through my next steps. "Margaret, I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me you'll be honest about what you think." She leaned forward, her kind eyes full of concern. "Of course, dear. What is it?" I told her everything. The money Michael had been sending, the assets I had discovered, the way Jessica had been treating me, the humiliation at the restaurant. Margaret sat back in her chair, her coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips. "Dorothy Mitchell, you've been living like a church mouse while sitting on a fortune." I didn't realize. I knew the money was there, but I didn't really add it all up until yesterday. "And this Jessica creature has been treating you like you're some sort of charity case? She means well, I think. She just assumes that because I live simply, I must be struggling." Margaret set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. "Dorothy, that girl doesn't mean well. She's trying to get you out of the way because she's embarrassed by what she thinks you represent. But honey, you represent something she'll never have." "What's that?" "Class. Real class. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself with designer handbags and expensive restaurants." That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I called a local interior designer that Margaret had recommended and scheduled a consultation for the following week. "I don't want to change everything," I explained to Sandra Williams when she arrived at my apartment, "but I want to update some things, maybe add some touches that reflect who I actually am rather than who I think I should be." Sandra walked through my apartment with a professional eye, making notes and asking questions about my lifestyle and preferences. "Dorothy, you have beautiful bones here," she said, running her hand along my solid wood dining table. "This furniture is quality. What you need isn't replacement. You need enhancement. Better lighting, some updated textiles, maybe some artwork that reflects your personality." "I have a budget of about $20,000, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. A year ago, I would never have considered spending that kind of money on decorating. That's more than enough to transform this space while honoring what you already have. I also made an appointment with a personal shopper at the department store downtown. If I was going to start living like the woman I actually was, I needed to dress the part. I want to look like myself, but the best version of myself, I told Caroline, The stylist who met me at the store. I'm 68 years old. I'm not trying to look 30, but I also don't want to look like I've given up on life. 3 hours later, I had a wardrobe that made me feel confident and elegant without trying too hard. Classic pieces and colors that complemented my silver hair and brought out my eyes. Clothes that whispered quality rather than shouting expense. That night, I called Michael. It was time to have a conversation we should have had months ago. Mom, how are you? Jessica mentioned you seemed upset after dinner the other night. Michael, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe I'm incapable of taking care of myself? What? No, of course not. Why would you ask that? Because your wife seems to think I need to be in assisted living, and she's been talking about it like it's a foregone conclusion. There was a long pause. Mom, Jessica just worries about you living alone. She thinks you might be more comfortable. Somewhere with more support. More comfortable or more convenient for her? Another pause, shorter this time. That's not fair, Mom, isn't it? Michael, when was the last time you actually asked me how I'm doing financially? When was the last time you inquired about my health beyond a general, how are you feeling? I send you money every month. I thought that covered it. The money helps, sweetheart. But I think you and Jessica might be operating under some assumptions about my situation that aren't accurate. What do you mean? I mean that maybe it's time for all of us to have an honest conversation about who I really am and what I'm actually capable of. The transformation of my apartment took exactly 1 week. Sandra worked with the efficiency of someone who understood that this was about more than interior decorating. This was about reclaiming my sense of self-worth. When she finished, I stood in my living room and barely recognized the space. My solid wood furniture had been polished to a warm glow and repositioned to create better flow. New silk curtains in a soft cream color replaced the faded ones I had sewn years ago. Elegant table lamps cast warm light throughout the room, and carefully chosen artwork, including a beautiful watercolor of the lake where Robert's property was located, adorned the walls. You see, Sandra said, adjusting the final throw pillow. You didn't need new furniture. You needed to honor what you already had. The apartment looked expensive now, but in a subtle, understated way that spoke of quality rather than flashiness. It looked like the home of someone who had taste, resources, and confidence. My new wardrobe hung in my freshly organized closet. Classic pieces in navy, cream, and soft gray that made me feel put together without trying too hard. I had also treated myself to a proper haircut and color at an upscale salon where the stylist had shaped my silver hair into an elegant bob that took years off my appearance. Jessica called that Thursday afternoon. Dorothy, I've scheduled that tour of Golden Years Manor for Saturday morning. I'll pick you up at 10. For a moment, I felt the old, familiar flutter of anxiety at her commanding tone. But then I looked around my beautifully appointed living room and felt something different, a calm certainty that I had never experienced with Jessica before. No, thank you, I said simply. I'm sorry? I said no, thank you. I won't be touring any assisted living facilities. There was a pause, and I could practically hear Jessica's brain recalibrating. Dorothy, I think you're being a bit unrealistic about your situation. We've already put down a deposit to hold your spot on the waiting list. Then you'll need to get that deposit back, because I'm not interested. Dorothy, be reasonable. You can't keep living in that little apartment forever. What happens when you fall? What happens when you can't manage the stairs? Jessica, I live in a building with an elevator, and I'm in excellent health. But what about the cost? You can't possibly afford to maintain an independent household on your income. This was the moment I had been preparing for all week. Jessica, I think there's been a misunderstanding about my financial situation. What kind of misunderstanding? The kind where you've assumed I'm struggling financially when I'm actually quite comfortable. Another pause. Longer this time. Dorothy, there's no shame in needing help, but pretending you're financially stable when you're clearly not isn't healthy. I'm not pretending anything. I'm telling you that I don't need assisted living because I don't need assistance. Dorothy, I've seen your apartment. I've seen how you live. You can't afford to keep up appearances forever. Jessica, when exactly did you become the expert on what I can and cannot afford? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I had never spoken to her this directly before, and I could sense her struggling to find her footing in this new dynamic. I'm just trying to help, she said finally. But her voice had lost some of its confident authority. I appreciate your concern, but I don't need that kind of help. Michael agrees with me that this is the best option for you. Then Michael and I will need to have a conversation about that. I hung up the phone feeling shaky but exhilarated. It was the first time I had ever directly refused one of Jessica's pronouncements about my life, and it felt like stepping out of a cage I hadn't realized I'd been living in. Margaret knocked on my door 20 minutes later. Dorothy, you look absolutely radiant. What's happened? I invited her in for tea, and her reaction to my apartment renovation was everything I had hoped for. My goodness, this is stunning. You've transformed this place into something worthy of a magazine. She settled into my newly arranged seating area, running her hand along the soft fabric of the updated throw pillows. You look different too, confident. What's brought all this on? I told her about my conversation with Jessica, and Margaret clapped her hands together with delight. Good for you. That woman has been treating you like a charity case for far too long. I think I've been letting her, I admitted. I got so used to being treated like I was fragile and needy that I started believing it myself. Saturday morning arrived and I was ready. I had dressed carefully in one of my new outfits, a navy dress with a cream cardigan and pearls that made me look both elegant and approachable. When Jessica knocked on my door at exactly 10 o'clock, I was prepared for her reaction. She stood in my doorway for a full 30 seconds without speaking, her eyes traveling around my transformed living room with an expression I couldn't quite read. You redecorated, she said finally. Yes, I did. Please come in. She entered slowly, taking in the changes with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. This must have cost a fortune. It cost what it needed to cost, I replied calmly. Would you like some coffee? I have a lovely Ethiopian blend that I think you'd enjoy. Ethiopian blend. A month ago, I would have offered her instant coffee from a jar. The shift wasn't lost on either of us. Dorothy, about the tour this morning. I told you I wasn't interested. But I don't understand. Where did you get the money for all this? She gestured around my apartment with obvious confusion. Jessica, sit down. I think we need to have a conversation. She perched on the edge of my sofa, her designer handbag clutched in her lap like a shield. You seem to be under the impression that I'm financially struggling, I began. I'm curious about where that impression came from. Well, I mean, this apartment, your clothes, the way you... She trailed off, perhaps realizing how her words might sound. The way I... what? The way you live so simply, like someone who has to be careful about money. And you assumed that living simply meant living poorly? Didn't it? I almost laughed at the genuine confusion in her voice. Jessica, I live simply because I choose to, not because I have to. There's a difference. But Michael sends you money every month. Yes, he does. Because he's a loving son who wants to make sure his mother is comfortable. Not because I asked him to, and not because I need it to survive. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to reconcile this new information with the image of me she had constructed in her mind. I don't understand, she said finally. I know you don't, and that's been part of the problem. The phone rang, interrupting our conversation. It was Michael, calling from London. Mom, Jessica told me you're refusing to tour the assisted living place. Can we talk about this? Of course, sweetheart. But first, I think your wife has some questions about my living situation that you might be able to help her understand. I handed the phone to Jessica, curious to see how this conversation would unfold. What I heard was the beginning of a very different dynamic than the one we had been operating under for the past 2 years. I watched Jessica's face change as she listened to Michael on the phone. Her confident expression gradually shifted to confusion, then to something that looked almost like panic. "What do you mean she doesn't need the money?" she said into the phone, her voice rising slightly. "Michael, I've seen how she lives. She shops at discount stores. She takes the bus everywhere. Her furniture is ancient." There was a pause as Michael responded, and I could hear his voice through the phone, though I couldn't make out the words. £2,500? Jessica's voice was barely a whisper now. "Every month? For 2 years?" Another pause. That's over $70,000. She looked at me with something approaching alarm. "Michael, why didn't you tell me you were sending your mother that much money?" I could hear Michael's voice getting louder, more defensive through the phone. Jessica's face was growing paler by the minute, but she said she was managing fine on her own. Jessica protested. "She never mentioned—" "Michael, are you telling me your mother has been sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars while letting us worry about her financial situation?" She handed the phone back to me abruptly, standing up and beginning to pace around my newly decorated living room. "Michael?" I said into the phone. "Mom, I just explained to Jessica about the monthly transfers. She seems surprised." "Yes, I can see that. She's asking about your other assets. I told her I didn't know the details, but that you and Dad were always good with money." Jessica spun around to face me, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled from running her hands through it. "How much?" she demanded. "How much what, dear? How much money do you have?" I looked at her for a long moment. This young woman who had spent months treating me like a charity case, who had humiliated me in front of strangers, who had made plans to ship me off to assisted living without my consent. "Enough," I said simply. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're entitled to." Michael was still on the phone. "Mom, what's going on there? Jessica sounds upset." "Your wife is processing some new information about my situation," I said calmly. "Perhaps we should all have a conversation together when you're back in town. I'm actually flying in next week for a client meeting. We could have dinner." "That would be lovely. But this time, I think I'd prefer to host. Here, in my apartment." After I hung up, Jessica was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Gone was the patronizing concern, the gentle condescension. In its place was something that looked suspiciously like fear. "You've been lying to us," she said accusingly. "I've never lied about anything. You let us think you were struggling. I let you make assumptions. There's a difference." She sank back, down onto my sofa, her designer handbag forgotten on the floor beside her. "The restaurant that night, when we were talking about assisted living, you knew?" "I knew that you were discussing my future as if I had no say in it, yes. But why didn't you say something? Why didn't you tell us you had money?" I considered my answer carefully. "Jessica, would it have changed how you treated me?" "Of course it would have." "Then I think you've answered your own question about why I didn't say anything." She stared at me, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. "You were testing us." I was living my life quietly and simply, the way I prefer to live it. You were the one who decided that meant I was poor and needed to be managed. But Michael has been sending you money for nothing. Michael has been sending me money because he's a loving son who wants to take care of his mother. The fact that I don't desperately need it doesn't make his gesture any less meaningful. Jessica stood up abruptly and began pacing again. "This changes everything." "Does it? How?" "Well, for starters, you don't need to be in assisted living. I never needed to be in assisted living. I tried to tell you that, but you wouldn't listen. And the money we put down for the deposit at Golden Years Manor will need to be refunded, as I told you." She stopped pacing and turned to face me with a look that was part anger, part embarrassment. "You made me look like a fool." "I didn't make you do anything, Jessica. Your assumptions and your behavior were your own choices." The phone rang again. This time it was Margaret from upstairs. "Dorothy, dear, is everything all right?" I heard raised voices. "Everything's fine, Margaret. Jessica and I are just having a conversation about some misunderstandings." After I hung up, Jessica was looking around my apartment again, but this time with calculating eyes rather than pitying ones. "How much did you spend on redecorating?" "Enough to create a space that reflects who I actually am." "But where did the money come from? Michael's transfers? Your savings?" "Jessica, my financial details are not your concern. They are if they affect my husband. And how exactly do my finances affect Michael?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently realizing she didn't have a good answer. "You don't understand," she said finally. "Michael has been stressed about you for months, worried about whether you're eating properly, whether you're safe in this neighborhood, whether you can afford your medications. We've been planning our whole future around the assumption that we might need to help support you financially. And now you know that those worries were unnecessary. But why didn't you just tell us? Why let Michael worry?" "Because I wanted to. See if my son would take care of me even if I needed it. And I wanted to see how his wife would treat an elderly woman she thought was beneath her." The words hung in the air between us like an accusation, which I suppose they were. Jessica's face flushed red. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" "Jessica, you've spent the better part of a year treating me like an embarrassing burden. You've made comments about my clothes, my furniture, my lifestyle. You've tried to control my phone calls with my own son. You've made plans to put me in a home without consulting me. And now you're angry because you discover I'm not actually the charity case you thought I was. I was trying to help. You were trying to manage what you saw as a problem. There's a difference." She picked up her handbag and headed toward the pew door. "I need to think about this. Take all the time you need, dear. But while you're thinking, you might want to consider why you assumed that living simply meant living poorly, and why you felt entitled to make decisions about my life without knowing anything about my actual circumstances." After she left, I sat in my beautiful living room and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of standing up for myself without apology. But I knew this was just the beginning. Jessica wasn't the type to back down easily, and I suspected her next moves would be more desperate than her previous ones. Michael would be here next week, and it was time for the whole truth to come out. Michael arrived on Tuesday evening, and I could see the confusion in his eyes the moment he walked into my apartment. He stood in the doorway, much as Jessica had, taking in the transformation with obvious bewilderment. "Mom, this place looks incredible." "Thank you, sweetheart. I decided it was time to create a space that better reflected who I am." He set down his suitcase and walked around the living room, touching the new silk curtains, examining the artwork, running his hand along the polished surface of the dining table that had belonged to his grandparents. "This must have cost a fortune." "Did you use the money I've been sending you?" "Some of it, yes, along with some other resources I had available." Jessica emerged from the kitchen where she had been making coffee, her movements sharp and agitated. Since our confrontation the week before, she had called me 3 times, each conversation more strained than the last. "Michael, we need to talk to your mother about her financial situation," Jessica said without preamble. "Jessica, maybe we should—" Michael began. "No, this has gone on long enough." She turned to me with the determined expression of someone who had spent days preparing for this moment. "Dorothy, I've been doing some research, and I think you owe us an explanation." "Research?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I called Golden Years Manor to cancel your spot on the waiting list. Do you know what they told me? They said the deposit we put down was $5,000. $5,000 that we paid because we thought you couldn't afford proper care." Michael's face went pale. "You put down $5,000 without asking me?" "That's not the point," Jessica snapped. The The point is that your mother has been letting us make financial sacrifices for her while sitting on a fortune. I never asked you to put down any deposit, I said calmly. In fact, I specifically told you I wasn't interested in assisted living. But you didn't tell us why. You didn't tell us you had money. Michael sat down heavily in my favorite armchair, looking between his wife and me with growing alarm. What exactly is going on here? Jessica pulled out her phone and began reading, from what appeared to be notes. I've been trying to piece together your mother's actual financial situation, and what I've found is very interesting. Jessica, this really isn't necessary, I started. No, it is necessary. She was practically vibrating with righteous indignation. Michael, your mother owns property in upstate New York that's worth over $200,000. Property that's been generating rental income that she never mentioned. She has investment accounts, life insurance payouts, retirement funds. We're talking about over $1 million in assets. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. Is that true, Mom? I looked at my son, this man I had raised and sacrificed for, and made a decision that would change our relationship forever. Yes, it's true. But why didn't you tell me? I've been sending you money every month, worried sick about whether you could afford groceries. Michael, let me ask you something. If you had known I was financially comfortable, would you have stopped sending the money? Well, no, probably not, but... And would you have stopped calling me every week? Stopped visiting? When you could? Of course not. Then what would have changed, except that you would have worried less? Jessica stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. What would have changed is that we wouldn't have made financial decisions based on false information. What? Financial decisions? I asked. The deposit for the assisted living facility, for starters. And Michael turned down a promotion last year because it would have required more travel, and he was worried about leaving you alone for longer periods. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Michael, is that true? My son shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It wasn't just about you, Mom. There were other factors, but it was partly about me. I wanted to make sure you were okay. Jessica jumped in triumphantly. See? Your secrecy has been affecting our lives in ways you don't even know about. I stood up and walked to my bedroom, returning with the manila folder that contained all my financial documents. I set it on the coffee table between us. You want to know about my financial situation? Here it is. Every account, every asset, every penny. Michael leaned forward, but I held up my hand. Before you look at those papers, I want you both to understand something. For the past 2 years, I've been watching how you treat an elderly woman you believed was struggling financially, and what I've seen has been very enlightening. Mom, that's not fair, Michael started. Let me finish. My voice carried an authority I rarely used with my children. Jessica, you have spent months treating me like an embarrassing burden. You've made decisions about my life without consulting me, you've humiliated me in front of strangers, and you've tried to ship me off to a facility so you wouldn't have to deal with what you saw as the inconvenience of a poor mother-in-law. Jessica's face went white. That's not what I was doing, isn't it? You never once asked me what I wanted. You never considered that I might be living simply by choice rather than necessity. You saw an elderly woman in modest circumstances and decided she needed to be managed. I turned to Michael. And you, sweetheart, love you though I do, have been so focused on taking care of me financially that you forgot to ask if I actually needed taking care of. I just wanted to help, he said quietly. I know you did, and I love you for that impulse. But help should be offered, not assumed to be needed. I opened the folder and spread the documents across my coffee table. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, insurance policies, the complete picture of my financial life. The truth is, I am a wealthy woman. wealthy enough to live anywhere I want, buy anything I need, and leave a substantial inheritance to my son when I'm gone. I live modestly because I choose to, not because I have to. Michael picked up one of the bank statements, his eyes widening as he scanned the numbers. Mom, this is incredible. You're sitting on over $1 million. And generating income from multiple sources, I added. The property your father left me has been rented out for the past 2 years, bringing in almost $3,000 a month. Combined with your generous transfers, my expenses, and investment returns, I've been accumulating wealth faster than I've been spending it. Jessica was staring at the documents with something approaching horror. You've been lying to us for years. I've been living my life quietly and letting you draw your own conclusions. The fact that you concluded I was helpless says more about your assumptions than about my circumstances. But the assisted living facility, she whispered, was your idea based on your assessment of what kind of life I deserved. You never asked me what I wanted. Michael was still going through the papers, shaking his head in amazement. Mom, you could afford to live anywhere. You could buy a house in the best neighborhood in the city. Yes, I could. But I don't want to. I like my life here. I like my neighbors, I like my apartment, and I like living simply. The difference is that now I'm choosing simplicity from a position of strength rather than necessity. Jessica suddenly stood up, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. This is unbelievable. You've made fools of us both. No, Jessica. I've revealed who you really are when you think you're dealing with someone you can look down on. And the revelation isn't very flattering. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. Michael, we need to go, now. But Michael remained seated, still staring at the financial documents spread across my coffee table. Actually, Jess, I think I need to stay and talk to Mom for a while. Fine, she snapped. But don't expect me to apologize for trying to look out for your family's best interests. After she left, Michael and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. I'm so sorry, Mom. For what, sweetheart? For not seeing you. For not really asking what you wanted or needed. For letting Jessica make decisions about your life. Michael, you are a good son. You've always been a good son. But being a good son doesn't mean taking care of me whether I need it or not. It means respecting me enough to ask what I actually want. He wiped his eyes and managed a small smile. So, what do you want, Mom? I want to be treated like the competent, independent woman I've always been. I want my choices to be respected, even if they're not the choices you would make. And I want my son to stop worrying about me and start living his own life fully. And I want one more thing, I added, looking him directly in the eyes. What's that? I want you to think very carefully about whether you're married to a woman who respects the people she thinks are beneath her, because that tells you everything you need to know about her character. 6 months have passed since that evening when I finally revealed the truth about my financial situation to Michael and Jessica. The changes in my life have been more profound than I ever could have imagined. Michael stayed for 3 more days after our conversation, and we talked more honestly than we had since he was a teenager. He told me about the pressure he had felt to succeed, his worry about being worthy of the sacrifices Robert and I had made for him, and his fear that I was struggling because of those sacrifices. I thought if I could just send you enough money, I could somehow pay back what you and Dad gave up for me, he admitted as we sat in my newly decorated living room. Sweetheart, you don't owe us anything. Raising you wasn't a loan that needed to be repaid. It was the greatest joy of our lives. We also talked about Jessica, and that conversation was much more difficult. She's not a bad person, Mom, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. She has very specific ideas about how things should be. And one of those ideas is that people who don't live up to her standards deserve to be managed rather than respected. Michael was quiet for a long time. I need to think about some things. When he returned to London, I wasn't sure what would happen next. But I had made my position clear. I would no longer tolerate being treated like a burden or an embarrassment, regardless of who was doing the treating. The first sign that things were changing came 2 weeks later when Jessica called. "Dorothy, I owe you an apology. I was so surprised that I nearly dropped the phone. I'm listening. I realize I made assumptions about your situation that were unfair. I thought I was helping, but I can see now that I was being controlling." It wasn't a perfect apology. There was still something defensive in her tone, but it was a start. "I appreciate you saying that, Jessica. Michael and I have been talking, and we think it would be good if we could start over. Maybe you could come visit us in London, see our flat, meet some of our friends." For a moment, I was tempted to say yes, to try to rebuild the relationship on better terms. But then I remembered sitting in that restaurant, listening to strangers discuss my poverty like it was a fascinating case study. "I'm not ready for that yet," I said honestly. "But I'm glad you called." The real changes in my life began when I stopped living like I was afraid to take up space in the world. I joined the country club that Robert and I had always talked about, but never felt we could afford. I started taking art classes at the community college, something I had dreamed about for years. I even bought a small, reliable car so I could stop taking the bus everywhere. Most importantly, I began using my resources to help others in ways that brought me genuine joy. I established a small scholarship fund at the hospital where I had worked specifically for nurses who wanted to further their education. I donated to the local food bank and started volunteering there twice a week. Margaret and I became even closer friends, and she often jokes that she's watching me bloom like a flower that finally got enough sunlight. "You're different now," she told me one afternoon as we had tea in my apartment. "More yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. For years, I had been living like someone who didn't deserve to take up space, who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and respect came my way. Now I was living like someone who knew her own worth. The lake property that Robert left me became a special project. I hired a contractor to renovate the old cabin, turning it into a beautiful retreat where I spend weekends reading, gardening, and enjoying the peace of the water. Sometimes I rent it out to families who want a quiet getaway, but mostly I keep it for myself. A reminder that I have choices and resources I had forgotten I possessed. Michael visits more often now, usually alone. Our relationship has deepened in ways I didn't expect. He sees me as a person with my own interests and capabilities rather than a responsibility he needs to manage. He's also been more open about his own struggles, including his growing concerns about his marriage. "Jessica wants us to move back to the States," he told me during his last visit. "She thinks there are better opportunities for her business here." And what do you want? I love my job in London. I love the life I've built there. But Jessica says I'm being selfish, not thinking about our future. I didn't offer advice, he hadn't asked for it, but I could see him working through his own understanding of what it meant to be in a relationship with someone who saw compromise as weakness rather than partnership. The most surprising development came 3 months ago when I received a phone call from Patricia Henderson, my lawyer. "Dorothy, I've had an interesting inquiry about your lake property. There's a developer who wants to build a small luxury resort on the lake, and they're interested in purchasing your land as part of a larger project. The offer was substantial, nearly double what the property was currently worth. But after thinking about it for less than a day, I declined. I'm not ready to sell," I told Patricia. "That property represents something important to me now." "And what's that?" "Choice. For too many years, I made decisions based on what I thought other people needed or wanted. Now I'm making decisions based on what I want." Jessica and Michael's marriage ended 2 months ago. Michael called to tell me, his voice heavy with sadness, but also something that sounded like relief. She said, "I've changed since we had the conversation about your finances," he explained. "She said I wasn't prioritizing our relationship anymore." And, "How do you feel about that?" I think she was right that I've changed. I've been thinking more about what I actually want instead of just trying to keep everyone else happy. And apparently, that makes me a different person than the one she married. Michael is back in London now, throwing himself into his work and rediscovering who he is outside of his marriage. We talk every week, but the conversations are different now, more like two adults sharing their lives rather than a son dutifully checking on his elderly mother. As for me, I'm living the most authentic life I've had in years. I wake up each morning in my beautiful apartment, surrounded by things I chose because I love them, not because they were practical or economical. I spend my days doing things that bring me joy, reading, volunteering, visiting with friends, working in the small garden I've created on my balcony. Most importantly, I've learned to see myself through my own eyes rather than through the assumptions of others. I am not a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. I am a woman with resources, experiences, and choices. I am someone whose opinion matters, whose comfort is important, whose preferences deserve respect. The monthly transfers from Michael continue, and I continue to accept them. Not because I need them, but because they represent his love and our connection. I use most of the money to fund my charitable giving and to create experiences that enrich my life. Last week, I booked a cruise to Alaska for next spring. It's something Robert and I always planned to do someday, and I realized that my someday had finally arrived. I think about Jessica sometimes and wonder if she's learned anything from our confrontation. I hope she has, for the sake of the people in her life who might find themselves on the receiving end of her assumptions and management. But mostly, I think about the lesson I learned about the importance of being seen and respected for who you actually are, not who others think you should be. I spent too many years accepting less than I deserved because I didn't want to be a burden. Now I understand that demanding respect isn't being a burden. It's being a human being who knows her own worth. And that, I've discovered, makes all the difference in the world. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story touched you, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. Stay healthy and value yourselves.